The Exarcheth Empire had seen countless civilizations rise and fall under its rule. Their warships, massive and bristling with weapons, had dominated the stars for centuries, bringing entire worlds to their knees. When their long-range scanners detected an unknown fleet entering their territory, the warlords barely paid attention. Another primitive species, they assumed, some lesser race that had stumbled too far from home. It was routine. The Empire would demand submission. The newcomers would resist, and then they would be crushed, just as all others had been before. It was an old story, one that always ended the same way. The Imperial Grand Warlord, Vorik Khan, watched the holographic projection of the unidentified fleet with an air of boredom. The ships were unlike anything in the Empire's records, sleek, angular, and disturbingly efficient-looking. There was no wasted design, no ornamentation, just pure function. The warlord smirked. They would burn just the same. He gestured to his communications officer. Send the usual message. They have one chance to kneel before the Exarcheth Empire. If they refuse, we erase them. The officer nodded, transmitting the Empire's standard ultimatum. Surrender and accept Exarcheth rule, or be destroyed. Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. The kind that stretched into discomfort. Vorik Khan's patience wore thin. Where is their response? He growled. The officer hesitated, then checked the system again. A message had arrived. He opened it, expecting desperate pleas for mercy or arrogant declarations of resistance. Instead, the warlord's crimson eyes widened in disbelief. It was a simple image. A small yellow face with tears streaming down its cheeks. Laughing. A laughing emoji. For a moment, there was silence on the bridge. Then the warlord's claws tightened into a fist. Never, in all the history of the Exarcheth Empire, had anyone responded to their demands with mockery. Anger burned in his chest. How dare they? He snarled. Around him, his officers looked equally stunned. Mockery was unheard of. Defiance was expected, but this was different. This was disrespect. Vorik Khan's rage boiled over. Mobilize the fleet, he ordered, his voice cold with fury. They will learn their mistake. The Empire's battle cruisers, each one large enough to cast shadows over entire cities, surged forward, their weapons charging, engines roaring to life. The Exarcheth had decided. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be an execution. The enemy fleet remained still. No evasive maneuvers. No attempt to retreat. They just waited. Vorik Khan sneered at their foolishness. Perhaps they had never seen a real war before. Perhaps they thought themselves untouchable. That illusion would shatter soon enough. Open fire, he commanded. Lances of energy erupted from the Empire's ships, streaking across the void toward their targets. But something was wrong. The beams never landed. In the span of a breath, the enemy ships vanished from the sensors, only to reappear in different positions as if reality itself had stuttered. The Empire's gunners tried to track them, but every time they fired, the enemy was no longer there. Panic spread across the bridge. Impossible, one officer whispered. Then the counterattack came. The Exarcheth ships shook violently as invisible forces tore through their shields. Armor designed to withstand planetary bombardments crumbled in seconds. Explosions erupted across their formations. They had no idea where the attacks were coming from. It was as if space itself had turned against them. Entire cruisers disintegrated before they could fire a second shot. The Imperial fleet, once a symbol of unstoppable power, was being systematically dismantled. Vorik Khan's mind reeled. This wasn't just superior firepower. This was something else entirely. It was control. The enemy wasn't fighting a battle. They were demonstrating something. The warlord's claws dug into the armrest of his command throne. Pull back, he ordered. It was a word he had never spoken before in his life. Retreat. A word that burned like poison in his throat. But before his fleet could escape, the communication screen flickered to life. A human appeared. A man, calm, relaxed, as if he were discussing something utterly trivial. "That was fun," the human said with a smirk. "You guys always start with the big speeches, don't you?" Vorken seethed. "Who are you?" he demanded. The human shrugged. "Just someone who got tired of listening to threats." He leaned forward slightly. "Your fleet's gone, by the way." "Well, mostly. We left a few of you alive, so you could go home and tell your people what happened here." The warlord trembled with fury. "You will regret this," he spat. "The Empire will." The human cut him off with a chuckle. "No, you will regret this. You assumed you were the biggest predator in the galaxy. You were wrong. Very, very wrong." The screen went dark. The transmission ended. Vorkan turned to what remained of his crew. Smoke filled the bridge, the alarms wailing in the background. He had to make a decision: stay and fight to the death, or return home in disgrace. His mind screamed for vengeance. But deep down, beneath all the fury, another emotion crept in. One he had never felt before. Fear. That Katarketh warlord clenched his fists. This wasn't over. It couldn't be over. The Empire had faced challenges before, but this was something else. He needed to report to the High Command. They had to understand what they were up against, and if the humans thought this battle had broken the Karketh Empire, they were mistaken. The Empire would return. But as the shattered remains of his fleet limped away from the battlefield, a single question haunted him. What if humanity wasn't just another empire? What if humanity was something far worse? The Karketh Empire had never known defeat. For centuries, their warships had burned planets, crushed rebellions, and expanded their dominion across the stars. They were the undisputed rulers of 1,000 worlds, their fleets a symbol of fear and power. No species had ever dared to stand against them, and lived to tell the tale. But today, something was different. Today, they faced an enemy unlike any other, an enemy that did not kneel, did not plead, and did not fear them. Humanity had laughed at their demands, humiliated their warlords, and now, as the Imperial fleet prepared for battle, a strange unease settled over the Tarketh commanders. Something about these humans felt wrong. Their ships were too small, too sleek, almost underwhelming compared to the massive dreadnoughts of the Empire. And yet there was an eerie silence from their side, as if they were waiting for the Exarcheth to make a mistake. Grand Warlord Vorken stood at the command bridge of his flagship, his crimson eyes fixed on the battlefield. His armada stretched before him, a formation of warships so vast that they blocked out entire sections of space. This was not just a battle. This was an execution. The Empire had been mocked, humiliated, and now they would remind the galaxy why they were feared. "Advance and destroy them," he ordered, his voice echoing through the bridge. The Empire's battlecruisers surged forward, energy cannons glowing with deadly power. Their weapons locked onto the human fleet, their firepower overwhelming, their dominance unquestionable. The war had begun. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The Exarcheth gunners fired, their weapons unleashing beams of pure destruction. The energy lances streaked across the void, but before they could strike, the human ships simply vanished. One moment, they were there, and the next, they were gone, leaving behind only empty space. Confusion rippled through the Karketh fleet. Had the humans fled? Had they used some kind of primitive cloaking technology? Then, without warning, the human ships reappeared, not where they had been before, but behind the Empire's formation. Before the Exarcheth could react, devastation followed. Their shields, once considered indestructible, flickered and collapsed as unseen forces tore through them like paper. The Empire's dreadnoughts, which had survived planetary sieges, now found their hulls splitting apart in seconds. Explosions rippled through the fleet as human weapons, silent, invisible, and impossibly precise, cut through the Karketh armada with terrifying ease. Officers on the command deck shouted in panic. Tactical screens were flooded with alerts, Ships lost, systems failing, formations collapsing. What's happening? Vorkhan bellowed, his voice filled with rage and disbelief. His crew scrambled to respond, but there were no answers, only chaos. The humans were not fighting a battle. They were playing with their prey. Every move that Exarcheth made was countered before it could even begin. Their warships, built for brute force and overwhelming firepower, were being outmaneuvered as if they were standing still. It was impossible. No species had ever been this fast, this precise. That Exarcheth had fought countless wars, conquered entire civilizations, but they had never faced anything like this. Their enemy did not fight like warriors. They fought like ghosts. Panic spread like wildfire. The Empire's captains screamed for reinforcements, but none came. The fleet was being torn apart ship by ship, and still, the human fleet had not suffered a single loss. Not one. It was a massacre. The mighty dreadnoughts of the Empire, each one carrying the firepower to reduce planets to ash, were now nothing more than wreckage floating in the void. The Empire had always believed in absolute strength, in crushing their enemies with overwhelming force. But now, that very philosophy had become their downfall. Against the humans, brute force meant nothing. Strength without control was useless. Vorkhan's mind raced. He had never known fear, but now it clawed at him, whispering the truth he refused to accept. The Empire was losing. He watched as the human ships moved with terrifying precision, cutting down his forces with ruthless efficiency. They weren't even in a hurry. They knew they had already won. The warlord slammed his fist onto the console, his claws digging into the metal. Retreat, he finally roared, his voice filled with bitter fury. Pull back. Now. But it was too late. The human fleet had anticipated this as well. As the remaining Exarcheth ships tried to escape, space itself seemed to twist around them. Their engines flickered, their navigation systems failed, and before they could break formation, the final strike came. In a matter of seconds, the last of the Empire's warships crumbled into nothingness. Silence filled the void. The once mighty fleet of the Exarcheth Empire had been reduced to scattered debris, their warships torn apart like mere training targets. The human fleet remained untouched, hovering in perfect formation, as if the battle had never even begun. Then, without warning, the main communications channel opened. A human appeared on the screen, seated casually in what looked like a simple command chair. He was not armored, not covered in medals, not displaying any sign of rank or status. Just a man. And yet, as he looked directly at Vorkhan, the warlord felt something he had never experienced before: helplessness. Well, the human said, smiling. That was quick. Vorkhan bared his fangs, his entire body trembling with fury. You dare mock the Empire? He snarled, his voice raw with rage. The human chuckled. Mock you? No, no, that would imply you were a threat. He leaned forward slightly, his expression turning almost amused. This wasn't a war. It wasn't even a fight. It was a lesson. He gestured to the wreckage of the Imperial fleet, the burning remains of a once mighty armada. And if this was your best, well, I suggest you don't try again. Vorkhan's claws dug deeper into the console. His pride screamed at him to retaliate, to fight, to do something. But there was nothing left. The Empire's forces had been obliterated, and he had no more cards to play. This was not just a defeat. This was humiliation. The human smile faded slightly, his tone growing softer. Go home, warlord. Tell your people what happened here, and if your empire ever thinks about challenging humanity again. His eyes darkened, the amusement gone. Next time, we won't be so gentle. The screen went dark. The transmission ended. Vorkhan stood motionless, his breath heavy, his mind racing. The warlord of the greatest empire in the galaxy, the conqueror of 1,000 worlds, had just been dismissed like an insignificant insect. The humans had destroyed his fleet, humiliated his people, and then, Instead of finishing him off, they had let him live. But the worst part, they were laughing the entire time. The Karketh Empire had never suffered a defeat like this before. Their once mighty fleet had been reduced to wreckage, their warlord humiliated before his own crew, and the enemy had not just won, they had mocked them. The humans had made it clear. They were not afraid of the Empire. They had not just defended themselves. They had torn through the most powerful armada in the galaxy as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Now, back in the Imperial core worlds, the High Command stood in a silent, grim assembly, their faces twisted in disbelief and rage. Never before had they needed a counterattack. The Empire had always been the attacker, the aggressor, the destroyer of worlds. But now, for the first time in their long and brutal history, they were forced to respond to a humiliation so deep that it threatened the very foundation of their rule. Vorkhan stood before the War Council, his claws clenched, his voice filled with seething anger. "We cannot let this insult stand," he roared, his fangs bared. "The humans humiliated us, destroyed our fleet, and then let me live as if I were beneath their notice. They have no fear of us. If we do not strike back now, we will lose everything. The respect of our subjects, the fear that keeps them in line, the very foundation of our empire." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. The warlords and admirals, all seasoned conquerors, could not deny the truth. The empire thrived on dominance, and without it, they were nothing. But there was a problem, a very big problem. The humans. No one knew how their ships had moved so fast, how their weapons had bypassed Imperial shields, or how they had anticipated every strategy before it had even begun. The Exarcheth had faced thousands of enemies before, but never one that fought like this. "We need overwhelming force," Admiral Karish growled. "A full invasion. Every war fleet we have left must strike at once, before they have a chance to react." Others nodded. If the humans were dangerous in space, then perhaps their weakness lay elsewhere. "We take the fight to their homeworld." Another general hissed. "Glass their planets, burn their colonies, leave nothing behind but ashes. The Empire has always won through terror. We must remind them of that." A low growl of agreement rumbled through the chamber, but there was still unease. The Empire had never fought an enemy like this. Their usual strategies of overwhelming force had failed before. What if they failed again? Regardless, there was no choice. The counterattack had to happen. Within days, the Empire's second-largest battle group was assembled. A fleet so massive that its formation stretched for thousands of kilometers across space. War cruisers, dreadnoughts, planetary assault ships, and carriers holding millions of troops stood ready. It was a force designed for one thing: revenge. Vorkhan stood at the command bridge of his new flagship, the Blood Tyrant, his gaze locked on the fleet's tactical displays. He had studied the battle against the humans, analyzed every mistake, every weakness. This time, they would not be caught off guard. This time, they would fight on their own terms. "Begin the assault," he ordered, and the fleet surged forward. At the edge of human space, the first colony world came into view. It was a green-blue planet, peaceful, its orbital defenses minimal. A soft target. Perfect. The Exarcheth fleet moved into formation, weapons primed. "No mercy," Vorkhan growled. "Show them what it means to defy us." The first wave of plasma bombardment was unleashed, streaking toward the planet's surface. The Empire's fleets had burned entire civilizations to the ground before. This would be no different. But then the alarms began. Something impossible was happening. The bombardment, millions of tons of destructive energy, never reached the surface. The plasma bolts curved, twisted, and then vanished, as if the planet itself had swallowed them. The Karketh crew stared in shock. Defensive shields couldn't do that. Before anyone could react, the human fleet appeared, not in front of them, where they had been expecting a confrontation, but behind them. Vorkhan's eyes widened. How? There had been no hyperspace signals, no energy distortions. The humans had simply arrived, as if space itself had bent to their will. Reverse course. An officer shouted, but it was already too late. The counterattack became a massacre. The humans did not fight like warriors. They fought like gods. The Empire's warships, built for raw power and brute force, found themselves helpless against an enemy that moved faster than their computers could track. Exarcheth cruisers exploded one by one, targeted with surgical precision. The dreadnoughts, once considered the pinnacle of Imperial engineering, were reduced to burning wrecks in seconds. Vorken stood frozen, watching as his fleet, his revenge, was torn apart before it could even fire a second volley. How could this be happening again? Then, the communication screen activated. The same human from before appeared, his expression calm, almost amused. "You don't learn, do you?" he said, shaking his head. "We warned you." His voice was devoid of anger, devoid of malice. It was worse. It was pity. Vorken's claws trembled. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "The Empire is vast. We will send more fleets, more armies. You cannot stop us all." The human sighed. "You still don't understand." He gestured to the battlefield, where the last of the Imperial fleet was falling apart. "This isn't a war. It's a lesson. You're not fighting us, warlord. You're being taught." His eyes darkened. "And you're very, very slow learners." The transmission ended. The battle was over. The Empire's counterattack, their desperate attempt to reclaim their pride, had been crushed even faster than their first fleet. The humans had given them one warning, one chance to walk away, and the Empire had thrown it away. Now, there would be no more warnings. As the shattered remnants of the Imperial fleet drifted in the void, the reality of the situation finally sank in. The Empire was no longer the greatest power in the galaxy. The humans had changed everything. And now, the only thing left for the Exarcheth was fear. That Exarcheth Empire had always believed in strength. They had ruled the galaxy for centuries, crushing civilizations under their might, reducing defiant worlds to smoldering ruins. They had never known defeat. Until now. Twice they had faced humanity. Twice their fleets had been shattered. And yet, even after witnessing the impossible, even after seeing human warships move with unnatural speed and fire weapons that bent the laws of physics, the Empire refused to understand. They still clung to their belief that humanity was simply a superior military force. A new enemy, yes, but still just another opponent to be conquered. They were wrong, and they were about to learn why. High Commander Vorken stood aboard the command deck of the last great Imperial warfleet, his face twisted in fury. He had been humiliated twice, but he was not broken. No, he refused to be broken. This time, he would not rely on overwhelming force alone. He had spent weeks studying human tactics, their movements, their impossible ability to predict every attack before it happened. He had devised a strategy, one that would finally tip the scales. This time, the Empire would not attack recklessly. They would lure humanity into a trap, force them into a battle where their speed and precision would be useless. The Empire would fight on their terms, and when the humans finally bled, the Empire would show no mercy. The plan was simple. The warfleet would advance toward an isolated human colony, one far from their central command. The humans would respond, as they always did, appearing from nowhere, striking with impossible efficiency. But this time, they would not be facing an ordinary fleet. This time, the Empire had deployed its ultimate weapon, an artificial gravity well, a device powerful enough to warp space itself, preventing any ship from escaping or maneuvering beyond a set range. No more surprise attacks, no more unnatural speed. Here, in this trap, the humans would be forced to fight fair. As expected, the humans arrived. They did not hesitate, did not speak, did not issue warnings. They simply attacked. But this time, something was different. The Imperial ships were ready, their weapons synchronized, their defenses reinforced against human tactics. The first wave of human warships found themselves slowed, unable to move as freely as before. It's working, Vorkhan thought, his claws tightening. The humans had been forced into a direct engagement. Now, the Empire could fight them as equals. But then, something changed. The human fleet stopped moving. Their ships did not turn to flee, nor did they attempt to counterattack. They simply hovered in place, their weapons silent, their engines idling. Confusion spread across the command deck. What were they doing? Were they surrendering? It made no sense. The humans had never shown fear before. Why now? They are analyzing the situation, an officer murmured, his voice uncertain. Perhaps they. The screens flickered. Every sensor, every scanner, every display went dark. For a brief moment, silence filled the bridge. Then, in an instant, every Imperial ship's systems reactivated. Only now, they were not in control. The Exarcheth fleet, their mighty warships, their entire operation, all of it, had been hijacked. Vorkhan's blood ran cold. Impossible, he whispered. A voice echoed through the ship's speakers. Calm, steady, devoid of arrogance, but carrying an undeniable weight. We have tolerated your mistakes long enough, the human commander said. You thought you were fighting a war. You were wrong. This is not a war. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, as if the very air carried it. You still believe we are like you, that this is a struggle of empires, of fleets and weapons, but you don't understand, do you? On the view screens, the human ships began to change. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then the truth became clear. Their forms were shifting, warping, evolving. What had once been simple starships became something else, something beyond the comprehension of the Exarcheth. They were not machines. They had never been machines. They were alive. Vorkhan staggered back. He had believed, like all Exarcheth, that the humans had simply developed superior technology, that their weapons were more advanced, their tactics more refined. But now, as the Warfleet's controls were ripped away, as the Empire's most powerful ships were reduced to toys in the hands of their enemies, the truth became clear. Humanity was not simply another species. They were something more, something the Empire had never encountered before. You believe in strength, the human commander continued. You think strength is measured in weapons, in fleets, in destruction. But true strength, true power, is something else. The human ships pulsed with energy, and the Empire's warfleet began to disintegrate, not from weapons, not from any visible attack, but from something deeper. Their hulls unraveled, as if the very concept of their existence was being erased. Vorkhan fell to his knees. He had never known fear like this. Not fear of death. He had faced death before, but fear of the unknown. Fear of an enemy that was not an enemy that did not need to fight. The Empire had always believed itself to be the ultimate force in the galaxy, the pinnacle of strength. But now, they stood before something beyond strength, beyond war, beyond anything they could comprehend. This is not a war, the voice said again, softer this time. This is a lesson. The Empire had been weighed. The Empire had been measured. And the Empire had been found irrelevant. As the last remnants of the fleet vanished into nothingness, as the Empire's once greatest warriors faded like dust, one final realization filled Vorkhan's mind before the void claimed him. Humanity's true strength had never been their weapons. It had never been their speed, their tactics, or their technology. Humanity's true strength was something the Empire could never understand. The great Exarcheth Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years. They had conquered countless worlds, crushed resistance wherever it arose, and enforced their will with an iron fist. They had believed themselves invincible, their power unchallenged. But now, everything had changed. The Empire, once feared, once untouchable, now faced something they had never imagined. something beyond their understanding. Humanity. They had tried to fight. They had tried to resist. But no fleet, no weapon, no strategy had been enough. Every battle had ended the same way. Their ships had been torn apart, as if they were nothing more than dust. Their defenses had crumbled. Their fleets had been erased. The Empire had fought itself strong. But now, in the face of true strength, they understood the truth. They had never been strong. They had only been unchallenged. Until now. High Emperor Calvorin stood in the heart of the Imperial Citadel, surrounded by the last remnants of his ruling council. The vast chamber, once filled with the voices of proud warlords, was now silent. There was no more boasting, no more arrogance. Only fear. The news had spread across the empire like wildfire. Humanity had reached the capital. No fleet had slowed them. No planetary defenses had been enough. The humans had not even fired their weapons. They had simply arrived, and the empire had fallen. Calvorin clenched his fists. He had spent his life believing that the empire was eternal, that nothing could bring them to their knees. But now, with every report, with every desperate message from fallen strongholds, he felt the weight of reality pressing down on him. The doors to the chamber slid open. The room tensed. Every Tarketh warrior, every noble, every leader present turned toward the entrance. And then they stepped inside. The humans. They did not come in force. There were no armies, no weapons drawn, no threats spoken. Only a single figure, a representative of humanity. They walked with calm, measured steps, their expression unreadable. And yet, their very presence was overwhelming. Calvorin had seen warlords who could command entire fleets with a glance, whose presence alone could strike fear into the hearts of lesser beings. But this was something different. This was not fear of power. It was fear of the unknown. For a moment, no one spoke. The council watched, frozen, waiting for the humans to make the first move. But they did not speak. They did not demand. They simply waited, as if they already knew what would happen. Calvorin swallowed hard. He had spent his life believing in strength, in the rule of might. And yet, as he looked at the human before him, he felt something he had never felt before. Powerless. Not because of weapons, not because of fleets, but because, in this moment, the Empire's fate was no longer in his hands. It was in theirs. Finally, he spoke. His voice, once commanding, now barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" The human regarded him for a long moment before answering. "We want nothing." Silence filled the chamber. The council exchanged uncertain glances. Nothing. It made no sense. Every empire that had ever conquered demanded something: resources, land, subjugation. But these humans, they wanted nothing. It was impossible. Calvorin straightened, forcing himself to reclaim what little authority he had left. "Then why are you here?" The human tilted their head slightly, as if studying him. "To see if you will kneel." A low murmur spread through the council. Some bristled at the words, their pride flaring. Others lowered their gazes, already understanding what was happening. The empire had already fallen. The humans did not need to force their surrender. They had already won. The only question left was whether the Exarcheth would accept it. Calvorin's mind raced. Surrender. It was unthinkable. The Exarcheth had never surrendered, not once in their history. They had always fought to the end, choosing death over submission. But now, for the first time, they faced an enemy that offered them a choice. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The humans could have destroyed them. They could have reduced their worlds to ashes, erased the empire from history. But they had not. They had given them this moment, this chance. The weight of it all crushed him. He had always believed that true power came from conquest, from domination. But now, as he looked at the humans, who held all the power, who could end everything in an instant, yet chose not to, he realized the truth. True power was not in destruction. It was in restraint. The Exarcheth had spent centuries believing themselves superior because they could crush others. But now, they stood before those who had the power to crush them, and who had chosen mercy instead. His legs felt weak, his breath came unsteady. And then, as the weight of it all became too much to bear, Calvorin did the one thing no emperor in the history of the Exarcheth had ever done. He knelt. Gasps filled the chamber. Some of the council members recoiled in shock. Others hesitated, their pride warring with the reality before them. But then, one by one, they too fell to their knees. Until, at last, the entire ruling body of the Exarcheth Empire was kneeling before a single human. The human did not smile. They did not gloat. They simply nodded. Then it is done. Calvoran lowered his head. The empire, as it had been, was over. But perhaps something new could begin.